After 40 years of marriage, my family doctor pulled me into his office and said, "I've been treating your wife for 25 years. Yesterday, a routine blood test revealed something that makes no sense unless the woman you married isn't who she claims to be." He showed me a lab result with a name I didn't recognize. I looked at it, and my entire 4-decade marriage came apart in a single line of text. I am Thomas Ashford, 68 years old. For 43 years, I was married to a woman I thought I knew. That afternoon, Dr. Weaver revealed the truth. The woman I called my wife existed under a name that wasn't hers. Routine medical tests, blood typing, genetic markers have become a hidden weapon, exposing identity theft that can stay buried for decades. The deception the doctor uncovered was not just a bureaucratic error. It was a carefully constructed lie that stretched back 4 decades, and as I would soon find out, it was only the first layer of a far darker secret. I met Margaret in the summer of 1981. She walked into my life at a Rotary Club luncheon in Scottsdale wearing a simple yellow dress and a smile that made the room feel different. She told me her name was Margaret Louise Campbell, that she had grown up in a small town outside Flagstaff, that her parents had died in a car accident when she was 19. She had no siblings, no family she could call, no photographs of her childhood. She said the fire that took the car had taken everything else as well. It was a tragic story, and I believed every word. I had no reason not to. She was warm, attentive, and utterly present. When you are a 35-year-old bachelor running a construction supply company, a woman like that feels like a gift you do not question. We married less than a year later, on April 17, 1982. I remember the date precisely because it was the day I thought my real life began. Our first daughter, Sarah, was born in '84. Our son, Michael, came 2 years after that. Margaret was a devoted mother, a careful homemaker, the kind of wife who kept our world running while I built the business. By the time I turned 68, Ashford Building Supply had 3 warehouses and 47 employees. I had provided for my family the way a man is supposed to. And Margaret had been beside me for all of it. Every holiday, every grandchild's birth, every quiet Sunday morning on the back porch drinking coffee while the desert woke up around us. But there were moments, tiny cracks I papered over with love and busyness. Margaret never voted. She said politics made her anxious. I never found a single photograph of her before 1981, not one, not a high school yearbook, not a faded snapshot. She explained it with the fire story again, and I never pushed. When Sarah needed her birth certificate for a passport application 15 years ago, Margaret misplaced the document 3 times before finally producing a copy from a safety deposit box I had never seen. These moments were small. They were nothing until they were everything. On the morning of September 12th, my doctor of 25 years called and asked me to come in alone. Dr. Weaver is a careful man in his late 50s, a physician who has treated my whole family for everything from flu to heart scares. He led me into his private office and closed the door. On his desk was a single sheet of paper. He said the practice had started offering genetic health screenings as part of routine annual physicals, something new, something proactive for aging patients. Margaret had her blood drawn last week. She had agreed to the test, he said, because she was as curious as I was about Alzheimer's risk. The results came back that morning, and Dr. Weaver sat there telling me that the woman I have loved for over 40 years did not exist on paper. Lab results matched a profile flagged in a national missing persons database. The name on the report was not Margaret Campbell. It was Elena Vance, a woman who disappeared from El Paso, Texas in March of 1980, less than a year before I met my wife. When I asked what the database flag meant, Dr. Weaver removed his glasses and said, "Thomas, I am required to inform you that this match has been reported to the authorities. There is an active investigation file attached to that name. And it is not merely a missing person case, it is a fugitive alert." Then he slid the paper across the desk, and I saw Elena Vance's face for the first time. She was younger, her hair darker and shorter, her expression guarded in the photograph. But it was Margaret. Unmistakably, undeniably, the woman I had kissed good morning every day for 43 years. I do not remember driving home. I remember pulling into my driveway at dusk and sitting in the car for 10 full minutes while the sprinklers clicked on and the garage light flickered the way it always did. Through the kitchen window, I could see Margaret moving inside, setting the table, adjusting a vase of flowers, completely ordinary, and I realized that I had never asked her for a single piece of proof about her past. Not a driver's license from before we met, not a childhood friend, not a single living relative. I had simply taken her story and wrapped my entire life around it. Now that story had a name attached to it, Elena Vance. I did not know the details yet. I did not know that by morning I would unearth a history of embezzlement, a suspicious death, and a secret that would make the lie about her name look like a small, forgivable thing. But as I watched her through the glass, the woman I loved smiled at the dinner she had made, and I felt the floor of my existence begin to crack beneath my feet. Because the file on Elena Vance included a finding I could not ignore. Her first husband had been found dead under circumstances the El Paso coroner called unexplained, and I was about to spend the night under the same roof as the prime suspect. I stepped out of the car and walked to the front door. Every footstep on the gravel felt like a countdown. When I entered the kitchen, Margaret looked up from the stove with the same gentle expression she had worn for 4 decades. She asked if I was hungry. I said yes, even though my stomach was a clenched fist. I sat at the table while she served meatloaf, my favorite, and I watched her hands. The same hands that had held our children, that had folded my laundry, that had rested on my chest during 1,000 quiet nights. Those hands might have killed a man. We ate in a silence that I filled with small talk about the weather and a roof repair at the warehouse. She nodded and smiled in all the right places, but the word prime suspect was a splinter in my mind, digging deeper with every bite. Every gesture I had once found comforting now looked foreign, a performance I had never thought to question. As she cleared the plates, I asked her if she had ever been to El Paso. Her hand paused just for a heartbeat before she said she had driven through once a long time ago. Nothing more. I felt the crevasse between us widen, a gap that had been there since the moment we met, hidden beneath a yellow dress and a beautiful lie. By 9 o'clock, she had gone upstairs to read. I told her I had paperwork to finish. I walked to the office at the end of the hall, locked the door behind me, and opened my laptop. The man who runs a construction supply company learns to follow a paper trail. My hands were steady, but my pulse was not. I typed Elena Vance El Paso into the search bar and pressed enter. The results filled the screen like the first crack in a dam. The digitized archives of the El Paso Times carried her photograph on the front page of the March 19, 1980 edition. The headline read, "Local developer found dead in home, wife sought for questioning." I scrolled paragraph by paragraph, my breath shallow. Edward Vance was 42 years old, a real estate developer with a dozen commercial properties in the city. He had been discovered by a housekeeper on a Monday morning, collapsed on the floor of his study, a glass of bourbon overturned beside him. The medical examiner's initial report listed the cause of death as undetermined. There were no visible injuries, no signs of forced entry, nothing that pointed immediately to foul play. But the article noted that Elena Vance, age 33, had not been seen since the day before the body was found. Detectives considered her a person of interest. They had questions. She left behind her credit cards, her vehicle, and a single suitcase still open on the bedroom floor. She simply vanished. But there was a second detail buried in the follow-up piece 2 days later. A forensic accountant hired by Vance's business partner reported that $210,000 had been transferred from the company accounts to a private account in Elena's name over the course of 6 months. The transfers stopped the day Edward died. The money was gone. Missing funds and a missing wife were not coincidences any detective would overlook. The word homicide began appearing in the reporting, even though no charges were ever filed. Because Elena had disappeared completely, the investigation went cold. The trail ended before it could lead anywhere, until now. I stared at the screen for a long time. $210,000 in 1980 was a fortune. It was escape money. It was motive. I matched that against the woman I knew, the careful homemaker who clipped coupons, who worried about the price of produce, who had never asked for a piece of jewelry or a new car. It did not fit, but the face in the grainy newsprint was hers. I was looking at my wife, and my wife was a wanted woman. And that was when my phone rang. The caller ID said El Paso Police Department. I let it ring 4 times before I answered. The voice on the other end belonged to Detective Rebecca Jimenez, Cold Case Unit. She had been notified by the national database the same hour Dr. Weaver had received the lab flag. She had already pulled the original file. She wanted to know the full name of the woman living in my home, how long she had been there, and whether she was inside the house at that very moment. I answered her questions as if I were a witness instead of a husband. She told me she would be flying to Phoenix the following morning to conduct a formal interview. She warned me not to alert the subject. She called Margaret the subject. When I hung up, the house felt smaller, as if the walls had moved closer while I was on the phone. I sat in the office silence and listened to the hum of the air conditioning. Margaret was upstairs. The woman I loved was 4 decades deep in a fabricated life, and now the machinery of justice was closing in. I had one night to decide whether I was still her husband or just another person she had deceived. I climbed the stairs at 11:15. The bedroom door was slightly open, a lamp still burning on her nightstand. She was propped against the pillows, a book in her lap, glasses perched on her nose. She looked up with that same warm expression I had seen every night, but this time I did not smile back. She set the book down. "Thomas," she said, "you look like you've seen a ghost." I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed. My voice came out lower than I intended. "Margaret," I said, "when we met, you told me your parents died in a fire. You said you had no photographs, no records, no one left. I never questioned it because I loved you. But tonight I need you to tell me the truth, all of it. Who is Elena Vance?" She did not flinch the way I expected. Instead, the air seemed to leave her body in a long, slow exhale. Her eyes glistened, but she did not look away. She reached over and took my hand. "I have been waiting for this night," she said, "since the day I met you." She told me everything. Her name was Elena Louise Vance. She had grown up in El Paso, the only child of a widowed mother who died when Elena was 25. She married Edward Vance when she was 30, a whirlwind courtship that turned dark within the first year. Edward was controlling, volatile, a man whose public charm masked a private cruelty. She showed me a faded scar on her inner arm that I had noticed 100 times before, a mark she had always attributed to a childhood kitchen accident. It was from a night Edward had thrown a glass at her. The missing money, she said, was not embezzlement. It was self-preservation. Edward had been bleeding the company dry for years, gambling on development deals that never materialized. When she discovered the fraud, she began moving funds into a separate account so that when the business collapsed, there would be something left to cover the employees and the debts. She kept it secret because she was terrified of what he would do if he found out. On the night of his death, they argued. He had found the statement from the hidden account. She described it in vivid detail, the way he raged, the way he struck her, the way she locked herself in the study while he pounded on the door. She heard the bourbon glass shatter, then silence. When she came out, he was on the floor, his face gray, a small trickle of blood from a cut on his temple where he had hit the edge of the desk. She called for an ambulance, but he was already gone. The coroner's official finding later cited a massive coronary event, a heart attack brought on by stress. But the missing money, the argument, the recent bruises she could not hide, they made her the only suspect, and she knew how it would look to a jury, a wife with a hidden bank account and a dead husband, so she ran. She drove west through the night, crossing the state line into New Mexico, then into Arizona. She left Elena Vance behind in a bus station, locker full of identification, and a life she could no longer inhabit. Margaret Campbell was born in a library, from a newspaper obituary for a stillborn infant. She built a new birth certificate, then a driver's license, then a whole existence. She never touched the $200,000. She left it in the account, untouched, because taking it would have made her the criminal everyone assumed she was. She cleaned houses, waited tables, and then she met me. "I wanted to tell you 1,000 times," she whispered, tears cutting tracks down her cheeks. "But every year we built together made the truth more dangerous. I loved you, I love you still. The life we made is the only true thing I have ever had. Please believe me." Her grip on my hand was fierce. I looked into her eyes, and I saw the woman who had held our children, who had sat through my parents' funerals, who had never once asked me for anything except to be loved in return. The story made a terrible kind of sense, and I realized with a sickening clarity that I believed her, because I wanted to, because the alternative was unthinkable. I pulled her into my arms. And we stayed that way for a long time, two old people clinging to a life that was about to be torn open by the morning. Later, after she fell asleep from sheer exhaustion, I went back downstairs to the office to think. The detective would arrive in a matter of hours. I needed to decide whether to defend my wife or to cooperate with the investigation. I poured a glass of water and opened the closet where we kept old tax records, looking for nothing, just needing to move. That was when I saw a small metal box I did not recognize pushed behind the filing cabinet. The lid was secured with a combination lock, but the lock had rusted through. I lifted the lid. Inside was a single item, a faded photograph of Edward Vance, his face circled in red ink. And beneath the photograph, in handwriting I knew as well as my own, were two words that stopped my heart. He deserved it. The photograph shook in my hand. The red ink circling Edward Vance's face was faded but deliberate, pressed hard enough to leave grooves in the paper. And those two words in my wife's handwriting, he deserved it, were not a confession of self-defense. They were a verdict. The woman who had wept in my arms an hour ago had not told me the whole truth. She had handed me a story that painted her as a terrified victim fleeing a monster, but this box told a different tale. This was a trophy. I set the photograph on my desk and sat down. My mind raced through every loving moment I had ever shared with Margaret, searching for signs I had missed. The way she sometimes stared out the kitchen window with a blankness that lasted a beat too long. The fact that she never spoke about the past, not even in fragments. If you love someone for 43 years, you accumulate a library of shared memories. But now, I realized that entire library was built on a foundation she had constructed. I could not trust a single volume. I needed more. I opened the metal box again, but there was nothing else inside except a lock of hair, dark, not hers, tied with a piece of thread. No note explaining whose it was, but I had a sick feeling. I returned the photograph to the box, closed it, and slid it back behind the filing cabinet. I would not confront her again tonight. I needed to understand the full scope of who I was married to before Detective Jimenez arrived in the morning. I barely slept. At 6 a.m., I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table while the morning light crept across the tile. Margaret came downstairs at 7, robe pulled tight, eyes puffy. She said good morning softly, as if testing whether the confessions of the previous night had changed the air between us. I forced a smile and said I had not slept well. She nodded, poured her own coffee, and asked if I still loved her. I told her I did not know who she was. The silence that followed was the heaviest I have ever felt. She set down her mug and sat across from me. Her voice was raw, almost a whisper. You found something, didn't you? Something that makes my story feel incomplete. I did not confirm or deny it. I just looked at her. She said, I told you the truth about that night, but I didn't tell you everything about the years before. Because the years before are not something I can speak aloud, and still expect you to look at me with anything but horror. Before she could continue, my phone rang. Detective Jimenez had landed early. She would be at the house in 20 minutes. I told Margaret to get dressed. I did not tell her who was coming. Something in my voice must have warned her because she went upstairs without another word. I used those 20 minutes to walk through the house one last time as Thomas Ashford, the man who believed his wife was simply a woman with a tragic past. By the time the doorbell rang, I had buried that man. Detective Jimenez was not what I expected. She was short, precise, with dark hair pulled back tightly and eyes that missed nothing. She wore a plain blazer and carried a leather satchel stuffed with file folders. She asked to speak with both of us together. Margaret sat on the couch, hands folded in her lap, composed as if she had been preparing for this moment for decades. Jimenez began by summarizing the cold case. Edward Vance's death had officially been reclassified as suspicious in 1991 after a new forensic review found traces of a sedative in his system, chlordiazepoxide, an active ingredient in Librium, a medication that Margaret, then Elena, had been prescribed for anxiety. The original coroner had missed it because the quantity in the bloodstream was low, but combined with the high level of alcohol, it would have caused respiratory failure in a man with a pre-existing heart condition. The investigators concluded that the sedative had been introduced into his bourbon sometime on the night he died. They had no proof of who administered it, but the combination of the hidden money, the flight, and the access to the medication made Elena the prime suspect. Margaret listened without moving. When Jimenez finished, I expected her to protest, to repeat her story about self-defense and fear. Instead, she did something that stunned me. She stood, walked to the hall closet, and pulled out a worn leather satchel I had never seen. She opened it and removed a stack of yellowed envelopes tied with string. These are letters Edward wrote to a woman named Patricia Dwyer, his mistress. I found them hidden in his office a month before he died. He was planning to leave me and take every asset. The hidden account I built wasn't just to protect employees, it was my only escape. Jimenez took the letters and read them silently. Then she looked up. "Why didn't you present these to the original investigation?" Margaret's voice broke. "Because I panicked. I was 23 when I married him, and by 33 I had forgotten what safety felt like. I thought if I ran, I could at least live. I did not trust the police to believe a woman with a secret bank account over a dead man whose business partners would call him a saint." She paused and then added, "But I did not kill him. I put the Librium in his drink that night to calm him down, to make him sleep. I had done it before. I never meant for him to die." There it was, a confession, but not to murder, to something reckless and criminal, but not premeditated. That he deserved it, in the box now read differently. It was the bitter afterthought of a woman who had spent 4 decades carrying guilt and relief in equal measure. Jimenez did not arrest her, not yet. She said the case would need to be reviewed by the district attorney, but given the new evidence of domestic abuse and the lack of intent, charges were uncertain. She collected the letters, took a formal statement, and left. The system would now decide my wife's fate. But the investigation had opened a door I could not close. The children had to be told. Sarah and Michael came that afternoon. I sat them down in the living room where they had grown up, and Margaret told them everything: who she was, what she had done, the name she had left behind. The room filled with tears and shock. Sarah, my firstborn, could not speak for 10 minutes. Michael kept asking if this was a joke. The foundation of their identity had just cracked, and I could see them struggling to fit a lifetime of memories into a new, darker frame. And then Sarah said something that took the air out of the room. "Mom, when I applied for my security clearance at work, there was a background check. They asked about my parents' birthplaces, their marriage certificate. I gave them all the information you gave me. Did any of it actually exist?" Margaret shook her head. Sarah's clearance, her career, everything might now be compromised. The lie was not just personal. It was institutional, reaching into my children's lives in ways I could not protect them from. That night after they left, I went to the office and retrieved the metal box. I handed it to Margaret and said, "I need to know about the photograph and the lock of hair." She opened the box and stared at the red-circled face. Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I kept that photo because I never wanted to forget what I escaped. The red circle was not a target. It was a cage. I marked him as the man who imprisoned me, so I would never minimize what he did. The lock of hair was my mother's. The only piece of my real past I carried with me when I ran. I kept them together because they were the two anchors of my life, the one who gave me life and the one who tried to take it." I wanted to believe her. The explanation fit the woman I had known. But the doubt that had entered my mind in Dr. Weaver's office now had a permanent residence. Because if she could hide this much for 43 years, what else was still buried? What other boxes waited in dark corners, holding truths I had never been meant to find? And as the sun rose on the next day, I received a phone call from a man who said he was the forensic accountant who had worked Edward Vance's case in 1980. He had one last piece of information. He said, something that had never been made public, and it would change everything I thought I knew about the woman I married. The forensic accountant's name was Harold Kemp. He was 81 years old, retired in Tucson, and he had read about the reopened case in a news alert that morning. He asked if I was sitting down. I was. He said, "Mr. Ashford, I was the one who found the missing money in 1980. But what I didn't tell the police, what I couldn't tell them without proof, is that Edward Vance wasn't just a gambler. He was laundering money for a cartel operating out of Juarez. The $210,000 your wife moved wasn't embezzlement. She moved it to stop him from funding a deal that would have buried the company and implicated half his employees in a federal investigation. She saved dozens of innocent people." I stopped breathing. Kemp continued. He had spent 40 years carrying this secret because coming forward in 1980 would have put a target on his own family. The cartel connection had been buried by Edward's death, and the funds Alina had hidden were never recovered, not because she stole them, but because she had already routed them back into the company payroll and vendor accounts before Edward found out. The only thing he had discovered was the account statement. He never knew the money had already been returned. He died believing she had robbed him. "So she didn't steal anything," I said. Kemp's voice was firm. "She prevented a catastrophe, and she did it knowing that if Edward caught her, he would have killed her. That woman walked through fire for people she barely knew. I have always believed she deserves a medal, not a prison sentence." I hung up the phone and sat in my office while the morning light stretched across the floor. The photograph in the metal box, the red circle. He deserved it. I finally understood. She was not marking a victim. She was marking a man whose death had released her, and probably many others, from a life of terror and complicity. The lock of hair was her mother's, the only witness to her former life. The box was not a trophy case. It was a reliquary. She had kept the two objects that anchored her to the truth, when every other detail of her life had been stripped away and replaced. I walked upstairs and found Margaret sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. I knelt in front of her and took both of her hands. I told her what Kemp had told me: the money, the cartel, the employees she had protected. Her face crumpled, and for the first time since this began, she sobbed without restraint. Not the measured tears of confession, but the raw, unguarded weeping of someone who had carried a secret so long it had calcified into her bones. "I never wanted you to know about Edward's world," she said. "I thought if any piece of it touched you, it would destroy everything. So I buried it, all of it, even the good parts, even the parts that might have made me look like something other than a fugitive." The days that followed were a blur of legal consultations and family conversations. The El Paso District Attorney's Office reviewed the file with the new evidence. The letters from the mistress, the forensic accountant's testimony, the medical records documenting years of abuse. They painted a picture not of a cold-blooded killer, but of a woman who had made a reckless, desperate choice to survive, and who had spent every day since making herself into someone who could never be that woman again. 3 weeks after Detective Jimenez first sat in my living room, the DA announced they would not pursue charges. The statute of limitations on the original offenses had expired, and the new forensic review concluded that Edward Vance's death was most consistent with an accidental interaction of alcohol and sedatives, not a deliberate homicide. The case was closed. But the legal resolution did not heal everything. Sarah came to the house alone one afternoon. Her security clearance review had been suspended pending the outcome of the case. She sat on the same couch where she had watched cartoons as a child and asked her mother how much of her own childhood had been real. Margaret took her hands and said, "Everything I gave you, the bedtime stories, the birthday cakes, the hours I spent watching you learn to read, none of that was Alina Vance. That was your mother, and your mother is real," Sarah cried. I watched my daughter wrestle with the same question I had been asking myself. Can a love built on a lie still be true? I did not have an answer for her. I only knew that after 43 years, I was not ready to call it false. Michael took a different path. He was angry, cold, and distant in a way I had never seen from my easygoing son. He could not reconcile the mother who had raised him with the woman who had drugged a man and fled across state lines. He stopped calling for several weeks. I gave him space. Grief and shock move at their own speed, and I had learned that forcing a resolution only deepens the wound. And then there was the final revelation, the one that came after I thought every secret had been wrung from the past like water from a stone. A genealogist named Diana Okonkwo called me from Houston. She had been tracking the real Margaret Campbell, the infant whose identity my wife had assumed. The baby Margaret had died at birth in 1949, and her death certificate had been misfiled in a county archive, leaving her birth record technically active. Alina had found it during her flight and used it to build a new life, but the genealogist had discovered something else. The stillborn infant had a surviving sibling, a twin brother who had lived, and that brother was still alive, living in a nursing home in Flagstaff. He was 90 years old, blind, and had spent his entire life believing his sister died alone and unnamed. I told Margaret. She went pale. Then she dressed, and we drove 2.5 hours to Flagstaff. She walked into that nursing home as Alina Vance, pretending to be Margaret Campbell, and she sat beside a man named Harold Miller who had never known his sister. She held his hand and told him that Margaret had been loved, that her memory had been honored, that she had not been forgotten. The old man wept. He asked if she could describe what his sister might have looked like as a child. And my wife, the woman who had lied to me about her name for 4 decades, described a little girl with dark curls and a laugh like bells, inventing a life for a dead infant so that an old man could finally find peace. It was the most honest lie I have ever witnessed. We drove home in the dark. The desert stretched black and endless around us. Margaret was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "I have been 2 women my whole life. Elena was the one who survived. Margaret was the one who lived. Today, for the first time, I felt like both of them were real." I reached over and took her hand. The road stretched ahead of us, and for the first time since Dr. Weaver had called me into his office, I felt something other than shock or anger or grief. I felt the quiet, steady warmth of a love that had outlasted secrets and survived the truth. I did not know what the next chapter would look like, but I knew we would write it together, not as Thomas and the woman he thought he married, but as 2 people who had finally met each other 43 years in. We live in a world that demands certainty. We ask for proof, for documents, for clean timelines and verified backstories. But the truth is that people are messier than paper. Every life carries chambers no one else enters, sometimes by necessity, sometimes by fear, sometimes because revealing them would destroy the very connections that keep us alive. My wife was 2 women, Elena Vance, who survived a monster and made a terrible choice in a moment of desperation, and Margaret Campbell, who built a life out of love and habit and quiet courage. For 43 years, those 2 women shared a single body, and I only knew one of them. The question I have asked myself every day since the truth came out is not whether she lied to me. It is whether I would have loved her if I had known everything from the start. And the answer, terrifying and absolute, is yes. I would have loved her anyway. That realization changed nothing about the facts and everything about how I carry them. This story is about identity, but more than that, it is about the weight of secrets and the cost of carrying them alone. My wife spent 4 decades believing that honesty would destroy her. I spent 4 decades believing I knew the person beside me. We were both wrong. And in the wreckage of those wrong beliefs, we found something unexpected. Not a fairy tale, not a clean slate, but a second chance to choose each other with full knowledge of the darkness and the light. Not every story ends this way. For many families, a doctor's discovery or a DNA test shatters everything without repair. The rise of genetic screening is peeling back layers of privacy that past generations assumed would remain hidden forever. Medical records now expose infidelity, identity theft, undisclosed adoptions, fertility fraud. The machinery of truth is becoming unstoppable, and we are only beginning to understand what that means for the ties that hold us together. If this story stayed with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments. How much of the past should remain private, and when does the truth become more important than peace? I have read every line of this account as a man who learned that love can survive almost anything except a refusal to face what is real. Thank you for listening. The next story is waiting.